And one day, Wyatt T. Walker, who was the executive director of SCLC, coming in and out of the office, he asked me if I would go to work for them. And I said, of course. It was a little bit more money, so I was glad to do that. Plus, I was really carried away with Martin Luther King Jr. To digress a little, when I first went back to Atlanta, I went to a mass meeting. That's when I first saw Otis. A girlfriend asked me to go to a meeting. She said, Martin Luther King Jr. is speaking. And I said, oh, I want to see Dr. King. And I went to the meeting. The students were having a very difficult time because they were upset over some of the agreements that the elders had made. And they were almost out of control, and they couldn't get them to calm down. And one young man stepped out and spoke to the group, and they calmed down, and that was Otis Moss, Jr. And I asked my girlfriend at that time, who is he? And she told me, she said, oh, that's Otis Moss. Don't you know Otis Moss? And I said, no, I never heard of him. But shortly after that, Martin Luther King came in, and he spoke to the crowd, and he was able to calm the crowd. And I said, you know, something is going on here that's very different, and I would like to be a part of it. Hard to describe a person when they walk in the room, you are so excited and carried away with their presence that you just want to sit and listen to them all the time. He was very funny, had a tremendous sense of humor. He was very fair. When things went wrong in the office, a lot of times Wyatt was a person that made very tough decisions, but Dr. King, people could go to him and appeal to him, and he was always a person who'd listen. I can recall the time when they were struggling with whether or not to march in Birmingham, Alabama. And because all of these kids could be arrested, and there were a lot of young kids participating. And they had a meeting, and Dr. King sat and he listened to all the students, he listened to all of the staff, he listened to everyone, and he knew that he could be arrested should he go out. And he went out of the room, and we all said, oh my goodness, he's gone out to pray and talk to the Lord. When he comes back, we know what's going on. And sure enough, when he went out and he came back, he put his coat on. He said, we're going. I cannot sit and allow them to control our behavior. He didn't operate on his own all the time. He did on his own, but he also took advice from others. He would talk with people, Wyatt Rustin, Andy Young, Wyatt Walker, Ralph Abernathy. He would consult with everybody before he made a final decision. Oh, Stan Levinson. Stan Levinson was one person that Dr. King depended on completely. He didn't make a move without Stan. Was very, very committed financially to Martin Luther King. He lived in New York. He was a very wealthy man. He is the one that really brought in Wyatt Rustin and many of the other attorneys, Bill Kunstler, and all of those who were from the legal perspective, but he also raised a lot of money for the organization. He had contact with Harry Belafonte. Many of the people who were the large donors, and mainly the Jewish community. The Jewish community was very supportive of the civil rights movement.
What was Dr. King's reaction when he was assassinated?
Everyone was devastated. And it reminded Dr. King of really the things that had occurred, that happened with him when he lived in Alabama, because they had to face the possibility that he was going to be assassinated even before he moved to Atlanta for the SCLC.
Did he get a sense of his own stature at that point? This is 60 to 66.
You know, I think he did. Early on, he always played himself down, and other people were constantly telling him how great he was. But he realized, I think later on, that he was having a tremendous impact on this nation, and it was really a burden for him. And many times he often wondered why he had been chosen to do it, because threats were coming from everywhere. And many times the FBI, they came to me trying to track and find out where he was, and I wouldn't tell them. And being young and inexperienced, I challenged them. It's a wonder they didn't take me and put me in jail.
I mean, during that time period, he had this I have a dream speech. Did he get a sense of that once he gave it? Did he come back and say, boy, did I nail that one?
Oh, no, that wasn't Dr. King. No, he always questioned himself whether or not he had done the right thing or how he could have done it differently. He was not a person who was cocky. He was not a person who felt that he nailed it, as you said. Even preaching a sermon, it was always that he could have done it a little better. It was just like he always felt he never really measured up to what God had intended him to be.
1968, Dr. King's assassinated. Where were you when you got the news?
I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, sitting at the kitchen table when Huntley Brinkley came on and made the announcement. It was devastating. The children were sitting at the table. I think we were about to have dinner at that time when it came over. And shortly after that, you got a call that it had occurred, but we already knew because we had heard it on the news. The blood had drained out of my body. I felt like I couldn't do anything after that. And I was frightened because I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know how the community would respond, whether or not there would be riots all over the country. And there were in many places. But it's hard. I can't even recall it because you get numb. Everybody was concerned of what is going to happen now that they've killed Kennedy. And then it happens to Dr. King. You just wonder whether or not all you're doing and what you've done and what you've sacrificed, whether or not it's worth it all. I think Dr. King changed the world in many ways, not just the South, in terms of bringing about the change in the laws. He brought about some changes in attitude. He introduced to the world that you can stand up against the strong forces, but you've got to make sure that your motives are pure. You have to not really be fearful, and you have to stand up against that's unjust. Really considered one of the most important people in our lives.
Terrific. Ladies and gentlemen, Edwina Moss.